Cortex Castle is probably the most brutal track in CTR. The track starts with a complicated section where you must navigate this courtyard with two very tight turns right after each other. But what makes the track notoriously difficult are the reserve requirements, where even a single missed boost or slightly imperfect boosting could be the end of a run. However, why this may be difficult, Cortex Castle is probably the simplest track when it comes to strategy. The strategy of Cortex Castle is simply get a lot of reserves and spend it all at the USF section. In this sense, Cortex Castle can easily be divided into a reserve stacking section and a reserve spending section. But most CTR tracks are not this simple. Even Roost Tubes has two stacking sections and two spending sections. And most other tracks have way more. Reserve stacking is simple enough to comprehend. It is when you are boosting, and you are boosting in sections where boosting does not lose you so much time, or alternatively, boosting here will be a lesser time loss than boosting elsewhere. You want to be boosting most of the time when you do not have a speed ghost or USF. That's fair enough. I think most of you will understand this concept. Reserve spending, on the other hand, is when we are not boosting. And usually this means that there is a reason for not boosting, such as that we are frogging a speed ghost or we just have USF right now, so any kind of boosting would kill it. Reserve spending sections are much more varied and much more difficult to optimize. Quite often, it is almost just as fast to just boost through a section as it is to drive the shortest line without drifting. Tracks like Roost Tubes, Mystery Caves, Tiger Temple can easily be divided into froggy sections and boosting sections. And otherwise, tracks such as Engine Labs and Cortex Castle can be divided into USF and not USF sections. But then, when you're looking at a track such as Tiny Arena, it is a little bit more difficult to see what is spending. Some parts of Tiny Arena, for example, you might be boosting, but you're using short boosts to turn faster, which in the long run is actually losing your reserves. That is a kind of spending as well. Another example is Crash Cove, where you froggy up the hill in the end, because frogging up hills is slightly faster. And this also is a form of spending, even though you do not actively have a speed ghost going on. However, what should not be considered a spender section is whenever you have to use a U-turn, because of course this just uses all of your reserves, regardless of how much you had. This is just a reserve killer. Other kinds of reserve killers are shortcuts that involve touching a wall or other such events where you must lose your reserves. There are even cases where you want to froggy an SG regardless of the fact that you will run out of reserves. Perhaps there is a turbo pad at the end of the SG section, or you just know that you missed a boost and you will not have enough reserves for the section anyways. It is this mechanic and this aspect of the original CTR game that originally made me dislike CTR Nitrofield and is currently making me dislike the Carters 2 actually. I find that these games, while good in many ways, lack this sort of optimization aspect of the original game. Of course, this is not the only reason CTR is a great game. Simply, I think even just the speed ghosts alone would make CTR one of the best games on the PlayStation 1. But the additional difficulty of optimizing reserve building and spending while driving the best lines possible makes CTR a multidimensional masterpiece. Another thing that this effect has on our game is that when we play the lap category of CTR time trials, we completely get to ignore this, making these two different categories entirely different in terms of how to approach them. In time trial laps, the only things you worry about are speed and your lines. You do not have to worry about optimizing speed reserve stacking. It's just not a thing. But there is also one specific track that essentially just ignores this aspect of the game, and that is Turbo Track. In Turbo Track, you do not really have to think about reserves the same way as you do in other tracks, because all you have to do is boost and hit the turbo pads perfectly. And I say this fully aware of the fact that Sam Bennett's new world record from a few months ago totally actually is reserve reliant and is an incredible record that I should probably make a video about. But in any case, Turbo Track is different, and it's a track that when you learn first time kind of breaks the rules of CTR. And rather interestingly, just like Nitro Fueled, Turbo Track has a much smaller variance of outcomes. It also is a track that does not have any speed ghosts, so you do not have to do much speed optimization, since you are always driving at the same USF speed. There is another interesting case where you have the track Oxide Station, where in the final section of the track it is very difficult to say what is the right approach. Should you try to maintain reserves, or should you always just go full speed ghost, ignoring your reserves, trying to hope you can get to the next turbo pad with enough speed to warrant froggying? Because in theory, you really do not need to have reserves in a lot of cases. Heck, if you have seen the tool-assisted speedruns for Polar Pass or Blizzard Bluff, you'll notice that reserves are absolutely irrelevant in these two tracks. You're always driving faster than Sacred Fire speed. But what I am saying, even though it might sound obvious in some way, in some sense, nonetheless, new players seem to struggle with this concept a lot when they join the leaderboards. I think a lot of players sort of understand that you have to boost and then you have to froggy and such. There is little consideration as to why we froggy and why we boost in the sections we do. And you will even sometimes see very high level players froggy in absolutely useless locations where you could just be boosting, getting you some extra reserves, or even just be driving, since, you know, frogging there actually makes no sense whatsoever. And these are things that, if you do not understand strategy, if you're just copying what other players are doing without understanding why they are doing it, will lead you to making very, very odd mistakes. In any case, these are some of the considerations to have when playing CTR and learning strategy, and I think it's actually a great idea to think about these things when playing the custom tracks that are now available, as you really do not have access to completed strategies you can just copy from others. You might realize that the way everybody else is playing is extremely unoptimal. And this is something that we in the community have had fun with exploring, as all of us are just, at the end of the day, just copying and imitating players that came before us, and now we have the chance and opportunity to map out the strategies for tracks that do not have them already. Thanks for watching.